He destroyed my father, then married my mother. I thought I had lost everything, family, trust, even hope. But the flowers on Dad's grave exposed everything. What I discovered turned my world upside down, revealing secrets so dark I could barely believe them. It all began with subtle changes, whispers in the neighborhood, small lies that seemed harmless at first. My father had always been a proud man, a man who worked tirelessly for our family and built a life based on honesty and trust. But then he met Richard. Richard was charming, successful, and smooth, the kind of man who could convince anyone that he had good intentions. At least, that's what everyone thought. Dad, trusting as ever, welcomed him into our home. At first I liked Richard. He seemed kind, attentive, and generous. He smiled, joked, and made my mother laugh in a way I hadn't seen in years. But slowly, a shadow fell over our family. My father began making uncharacteristic mistakes, forgetting things, misplacing documents, and getting nervous about finances. Richard was always there, offering help, advice, and subtle guidance, but something didn't feel right. One day, I stumbled upon a series of documents my father had been hiding. Bank statements, contracts, letters, evidence that someone was manipulating him. Someone was dismantling everything he had worked for. I wanted to confront him, but fear held me back. I couldn't believe that the man who had been like a second father to me could be capable of betrayal. And yet the truth was undeniable. Richard had been slowly taking control of Dad's finances, isolating him from friends and weakening his position. Then the unthinkable happened. My father, once strong and vibrant, fell ill under mysterious circumstances. Doctors were vague, explanations didn't add up, and every day he grew weaker. Meanwhile, Richard's influence over my mother increased. He comforted her, advised her, and slowly became the center of our lives in ways that felt wrong. I wanted to scream, to warn Dad, to reveal the truth, but he was too trusting, too proud to listen to suspicion about someone he had welcomed into our home. After my father's passing, the world seemed to shift. Richard moved in closer to my mother, offering stability in a way that seemed comforting, but felt calculated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Everything he did was publicly charming, privately controlling. And the more I observed, the more I realized that he had not only destroyed my father's health and spirit, but had positioned himself to step into a role that was never his to claim. Months passed, and the family's life seemed to settle, at least on the surface. My mother appeared content, Richard seemed loving, and everyone else accepted the new arrangement. But I couldn't. Every time I walked past my father's grave, a pit of unease grew in my stomach. Something about the timing, the circumstances, and the way Richard carried himself felt off, like a puzzle I hadn't yet solved. And then the flowers arrived. On Dad's grave, fresh, unexpected flowers, flowers that were not from my mother, not from friends, not from me. Flowers that held a message, one that would finally expose the truth behind the man who had destroyed my father and tried to take everything for himself. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments about which country you're watching this video from. Enjoy the story. The flowers were the first clue that shattered the carefully constructed facade. I had no idea what I would uncover next would reveal lies, betrayal, and secrets far darker than I had ever imagined. After seeing the unexpected flowers on Dad's grave, something inside me shifted. That simple gesture, it seemed innocent to anyone else, felt deliberate, almost as if someone wanted me to notice, to pay attention. I couldn't explain it at first. Who would send flowers without leaving a note? And why now, after months of silence? My curiosity quickly turned to suspicion, and suspicion to determination. I had to find out what Richard was hiding. I started by looking through my father's old office, a place I had avoided since his death. Papers were scattered, drawers locked, and a faint smell of dust and old wood hung in the air. As I rifled through folders, I began noticing inconsistencies, bills that didn't make sense, checks written to unfamiliar companies, and documents with signatures that didn't look quite right. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Richard's influence over Dad had been much more calculated than I had imagined. This wasn't just subtle manipulation, this was a systematic takeover. Then came the first undeniable proof. A ledger tucked behind a pile of old financial statements revealed something shocking. Money had been siphoned from Dad's accounts, slowly and deliberately, into shell companies linked to Richard. My heart raced. Every detail pointed to betrayal, and the realization hit me like a punch. Richard had not just destroyed my father's business reputation, he had destroyed his life. The anger I felt was raw, but so was a cold, sharp determination. I couldn't let this go unnoticed. I decided to follow Richard discreetly, to see how he moved when he thought no one was watching. That's when I noticed the pattern. He met with men my father had warned me about, associates whose names had come up in the documents I had uncovered. The meetings were quick, secretive, and always in places where casual observers wouldn't notice. Every encounter reinforced what I was beginning to believe. Richard wasn't just ambitious, he was dangerous. He had carefully dismantled my father's life and positioned himself to step into the role he never deserved. The more I investigated, the more details surfaced. Phone records showed calls at odd hours to numbers I didn't recognize. Emails hinted at backroom deals. And even my mother, oblivious to the full picture, had been subtly influenced. Richard's charm, the way he made her feel protected, was all part of the manipulation. It became painfully clear that he had calculated every move to isolate my father, weaken his defenses, and secure control over everything Dad had worked for. Late at night, I sat on the porch thinking about what I had uncovered so far. The anger was there, yes, but also a creeping fear. Richard wasn't reckless. He was smart, patient, and dangerous. I had to be smarter, more careful. Every step I took had to be precise. Any mistake could put me or my mother in jeopardy. And yet I knew I couldn't stop. The flowers had started it, but now it was up to me to finish it, to reveal the truth, expose the lies, and confront the man who had destroyed my father and tried to take everything for himself. I realized that the next steps would be crucial. I needed allies, evidence, and a plan. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and I had to be ready. The facade Richard had built was fragile, but it was dangerous, and the truth behind those flowers, the message they carried, was about to change everything. After weeks of digging through my father's old files, following Richard discreetly, and documenting every suspicious move, I began to uncover a pattern that was far more sinister than I had imagined. Richard's charm, the smiles, the reassurance he offered my mother, it was all a mask. Behind it was a calculated, ruthless plan to control everything my father had built. Every financial move, every strategic suggestion, even the timing of my father's decline now made sense in a chilling way. One evening, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Hidden in a locked cabinet, in a folder labeled simply with Dad's initials, were letters from Richard's previous associates and ex-business partners. Each one painted a disturbing picture. He had a history of manipulation, betrayal, and even ruin. One letter described how he had systematically destroyed a business partner, seizing their assets and leaving them in financial ruin. Another detailed threats and intimidation tactics he had used to get his way. Reading these, I realized my father hadn't been an isolated victim. Richard had a track record, a blueprint for control and destruction. I also found notes and photos that suggested Richard had been tracking our family long before he entered our lives. Dates, addresses, even patterns of our daily routines were documented meticulously. It became clear that Richard's arrival wasn't coincidental. He had studied my father, identified weaknesses, and positioned himself perfectly to exploit them. The realization was terrifying. My father hadn't just been betrayed, he had been targeted, and I had walked right into the aftermath, watching the pieces fall into place while my mother unknowingly trusted him. Around the same time, I started noticing small anomalies in my mother's behavior. She was overly protective of Richard, quick to dismiss any suspicions I mentioned, and sometimes defensive in ways that didn't make sense. I began to suspect that Richard had subtly influenced her, gradually shaping her perception of events so that I would seem paranoid or overreacting. The psychological control was as strong as the financial manipulation. One afternoon, while reviewing a series of emails my father had saved, I found the most alarming discovery yet. Richard had been in contact with lawyers, advisors, even family friends during Dad's illness, always behind the scenes, ensuring that he was in the right place at the right time to gain influence. Every act, every step was deliberate. He had orchestrated not only my father's downfall, but also the transition of trust and authority directly into his hands. By now, the anger I had felt in the beginning had transformed into a calculated resolve. I couldn't confront him blindly. I had to understand every move, every secret, and every method of manipulation he had used. I began making detailed records of his patterns, comparing them to my father's final months, and slowly a clearer picture emerged. Richard wasn't just a husband in waiting. He was a predator who had destroyed a man he envied and stepped into a life that wasn't his. The flowers on Dad's grave came back to mind. They weren't just a clue, they were a warning, or perhaps a message from someone who had been observing Richard and knew the truth. They were proof that the past could no longer be ignored, that someone or something was watching, and that Richard's carefully built facade might finally crumble. I realized the confrontation was inevitable. The next steps I took had to be precise, carefully planned, and backed by undeniable evidence. Because once the truth came to light, there would be no turning back, and Richard would fight to protect everything he had stolen. By now, I knew the truth. Richard had destroyed my father, manipulated my mother, and stepped into a life that wasn't his. The flowers on Dad's grave had been the first sign that the past refused to stay buried, but uncovering proof meant stepping into dangerous territory. I couldn't confront him blindly, not after seeing how calculated and ruthless he truly was. Every move had to be precise, every detail documented. I started systematically gathering evidence. Hidden financial statements, emails, photographs, and even recordings of secret meetings became part of a dossier I compiled meticulously. Late nights were spent cross-referencing dates, verifying accounts, and ensuring that every piece of proof could stand up to scrutiny. I wasn't just doing this for revenge. I needed to expose the truth to protect my mother and preserve my father's legacy. But danger was never far behind. One night, as I left my apartment to follow a lead on Richard's recent activities, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't unusual for the neighborhood, but something about its presence felt deliberate. For hours, it moved in tandem with me, silently tracking my every move. I ducked into a cafe, pretending to be absorbed in a book, but I knew I was being watched. Whoever was following me wasn't just a casual observer. They knew I was onto something. Despite the fear, I couldn't turn back. I traced Richard's pattern of meetings with his associates, noting locations, times, and behaviors. He was always careful, always planning, but even the most careful predator makes mistakes. One night, I followed him to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed abandoned but was filled with signs of illicit business, stacks of documents, locked filing cabinets, and people moving about cautiously. I couldn't confront him then, but I took photos, recorded observations, and knew that each piece of evidence would be crucial. At home, my mother remained blissfully unaware of the depth of Richard's manipulation. She trusted him, leaned on him, and even defended him when I raised concerns. I realized that confronting Richard directly without evidence could destroy her trust and put us both in danger. The flowers on Dad's grave had reminded me that someone outside of our circle might be watching, and I had to use that to my advantage. I reached out discreetly to a private investigator and a trusted family friend, someone my father had relied on years ago. Together, we pieced together the financial and personal manipulations Richard had executed. We discovered hidden bank accounts, falsified legal documents, and even subtle psychological tactics aimed at isolating my mother. It was a web of deception so intricate that it was difficult to believe one man could orchestrate it all alone. As I prepared to confront Richard, I realized something critical. The flowers had been more than a clue. They had been a warning. The past, my father's legacy, and the truth were all converging in a way that demanded action. The next step wouldn't just be about exposing him. It would be about reclaiming control, protecting my mother, and honoring my father's memory. With the evidence in hand and a plan carefully mapped out, I knew the confrontation was inevitable. Richard had underestimated me, assuming I would be paralyzed by grief and fear. But I had spent months uncovering his secrets, documenting his lies, and preparing for this moment. The stage was set. The next move would determine everything. Justice for my father, protection for my mother, and the unmasking of the man who thought he could destroy our family without consequences. The day had finally come. I had gathered every piece of evidence, traced every suspicious move, and carefully documented Richard's manipulations. The flowers on Dad's grave had been a catalyst, but now it was time to confront him with the truth. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was seeking justice, clarity, and a chance to reclaim the life my father had worked so hard to protect. I arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing family matters. My mother, oblivious to the full extent of Richard's deception, joined reluctantly, trusting the man she thought had always been on her side. Richard arrived confident, his trademark charm in place, unaware that every secret, every lie, every manipulation was about to be laid bare. I started calmly, presenting documents, photos, and financial records in a methodical way. Richard's confident smile wavered as he realized the depth of what I had uncovered. Each piece of evidence told the story of his calculated control, how he had isolated my father, undermined his health, and systematically taken over the family's finances. The more I revealed, the more his facade began to crumble. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She looked at Richard, the man she had trusted, and then at me, trying to reconcile the truth. I could see the realization hit her like a wave. All the subtle ways Richard had manipulated her, the late-night meetings, the persuasion, the quiet influence, it had been orchestrated. Her trust had been exploited, her grief manipulated, and her husband-to-be had been working against the very man she loved. Richard tried to argue, to charm his way out, but every lie had already been disproved. The evidence was undeniable. The financial records, letters from previous associates, and documentation of his patterns of deceit left him cornered. I calmly explained how he had targeted my father, then inserted himself into our lives to claim everything he could. For the first time, he seemed genuinely afraid, not of me, but of the consequences that were finally catching up with him. My mother finally understood the full scope of what had happened. Tears streamed down her face as she realized that the man she had leaned on had been orchestrating her family's ruin all along. She turned to me, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of solidarity, a bond forged through grief, discovery, and resilience. We had uncovered the truth together. The aftermath was swift. With the evidence in hand, law enforcement began formal investigations into Richard's actions. His past manipulations, both financial and personal, were exposed, and the extent of his calculated deceit became clear to everyone. He was removed from the family's affairs, and my father's legacy, though scarred by his manipulation, was finally restored. Standing once again at my father's grave, I looked at the flowers. These weren't a warning anymore. They symbolized the unveiling of truth, the resilience of a family that refused to be destroyed, and the justice that had been delayed but never denied. I realized that while Richard had caused immense pain, he had also forced me to grow stronger, smarter, and more aware of the fragility and power of trust. This wasn't just about revenge or inheritance. It was about reclaiming the truth, protecting the people I loved, and ensuring that no one could manipulate or destroy us again. The flowers were the first clue, the spark that led me on this journey. And now the full story had been revealed, the betrayal exposed, and the legacy restored. Justice had been served, and our family could finally begin to heal.